2 months after an initial fragile ceasefire, the United States and Iran have agreed what seems like a slightly more long-term peace deal. Now, as usual, the announcement was first made by Donald Trump on Truth Social. So he posted, "The deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran is now complete. Congratulations to all. I hereby fully authorize the toll-free opening of the Strait of Hormuz and simultaneously herewith authorize the immediate removal of the United States naval blockade. Ships of the world, start your engines. Let the oil flow. President Donald J. Trump." Often, we've seen Donald Trump sort of come out and say a deal is about to be made or a deal has been made, it's brilliant, and then the Iranians come out and say, I'm not so sure, mate. This time, the Iranians confirmed that Trump was announcing a genuine agreement that they had also agreed to. On Monday, the Secretariat of Iran's Supreme National Security Council released this statement. Based on the approval of the Supreme National Security Council, the text of the Memorandum of Understanding regarding the end-of-war negotiations, the Islamabad talks between Iran and the United States, was finalized on the evening of June the 15th. Under the agreement reached, the war and military operations on all fronts, including Lebanon, are ended immediately and permanently. Furthermore, the naval blockade against Iran is terminated immediately and completely. So we have a deal. Good news. The Strait of Hormuz will be reopened. The US will end its blockade of Iranian ports. And crucially, really important that this was included in it, Israel will in theory be forced to cease its war on Lebanon. That's why Netanyahu was not very happy about all of this. What about the issues, though, which made Trump and Netanyahu claim this war was necessary in the first place, namely the enrichment of uranium by Iran? Well, the Memorandum of Understanding between the two nations is still yet to be published, but reports suggest contentious issues such as Iran's nuclear program may have been kicked into the long grass to be sort of decided or debated further down the line in negotiations. And US Vice President J.D. Vance has said there are lots of details yet to be agreed.
Well, our expectation is that the strait is going to be opened in a toll-free way for the long term, and that's the sort of thing that we're going to figure out in these technical negotiations. You know, there are a lot of very important details to figure out that we're actually going to sit at the table and discuss together and figure out a path forward on these details. For example, they've committed to destroy and dispose of their stockpile of highly enriched material. That's the highly enriched uranium that they accumulated over the Obama administration and over the Biden administration. And what we've said is, okay, let's talk about how exactly we're going to do that. They want access to an unsanctioned economy. We've talked about, okay, we're open to that, but that would require a long-term commitment to the inspection and verification regime that I just talked about. So a lot of these details are going to be figured out during those 60-day talks. We feel quite confident that we're in a strong position here. Fundamentally, we have the leverage. We have the diplomatic, economic, and military leverage, but we also are extending an open hand to the Iranians and saying, if you guys negotiate in good faith and you make that long-term commitment not to develop nuclear weapons, then we are going to make sure that your country is successful. If, however, you refuse to meet us halfway, then we're going to continue to apply the pressure that we've seen build up economically in particular, and that's going to be bad for them, and fundamentally, it's going to be bad for the region.
So that was J.D. Vance sounding a lot like the Trump administration is willing to agree to something along the lines of Obama's nuclear deal, which Donald Trump ripped up in his first term. Now, one might also question whether J.D. Vance is correct that the US still holds all the cards, considering Iran can still close the Strait of Hormuz as and when it pleases. However, when we move beyond American cope, is this a deal we should welcome? Well, I spoke earlier today to Esfandyar Batmanghelidj, CEO of Bourse Bazaar. We've had him on the show before, brilliant guest. That's a think tank promoting peace and economic development in West Asia.
I think it's good news that we've gotten to this point. The crisis had gone on really for way too long, and it was a really dangerous moment for the region at large, because had the negotiations for this framework deal fallen apart, there was every possibility that we would have ended up back into a full-blown conflict. And so I think a lot of credit goes to the regional countries that stepped in to help facilitate this deal through their mediation, through formulating ideas to bridge the gaps between the US and Iran. And I think actually that's ultimately why I am somewhat optimistic after the agreement, not so much because I think that this framework deal will really reset US-Iran relations. There's a long road ahead for further technical negotiations, and of course, a lot of issues that seem just really beyond the Trump administration's capability to address. But if you are going to look at the Middle East and think about, well, what are the factors that you need to prevent the region sliding back into a major crisis, as we saw with the war at the beginning of this year? The capacity for regional diplomacy and the ability of regional states to find a common voice in pushing for a peace deal, that's very positive. And I think hopefully it's something that can be built upon when we think about what security looks like in the Middle East in the future.
And what were the sticking points? What are the concessions that have been made by either side here? Because I suppose it's not clear how this is different from just a sort of bog standard ceasefire. What are the sort of concrete things which have been agreed here that we didn't see 2 months ago?
Michael, the thing is that a lot of the terms of the agreement feel quite standard, or they feel like things we've seen before. I mean, you've already had critics of this peace deal going after the Trump administration for agreeing to a deal that looks a lot like the Iran nuclear agreement in terms of the way in which it balances Iranian concessions on its nuclear program with American concessions around sanctions relief. But there's a reason for this, because the challenge of a US-Iran deal has not principally been one of the technical parameters of getting the two sides to find some way of a win-win formula, basically, to come out of this cycle of conflict. The challenge has always been a political one. And the concrete kind of steps that we see in this framework agreement, for example, the fact that it seems that after the Israeli strikes on Lebanon, just on the eve of the signing of the agreement, the Trump administration agreed that rather than in a slow and incremental fashion removing the blockade of Iran, the naval blockade, it would instead immediately remove the blockade as a confidence-building measure for the Iranian side, keep them engaged in the agreement. What that demonstrates is that ultimately this is about the two sides showing the political will for the leadership to put together a deal that ultimately has a lot of critics, both in Tehran and in Washington. I mean, we've seen in the last few days vocal criticism of the deal from hardliners in Tehran. We've seen vocal criticism of the deal from what we can call hardliners in Washington. And so ultimately, I think what will make or break this deal is whether or not the Trump administration and the current Iranian leadership have the resolve to keep going with the diplomacy, even though there will be aspects of the negotiated agreement, those technical terms that are politically unpopular or seen as maybe too great of a concession given the optics around this kind of US-Iran diplomacy.
And you've said there that Trump is being criticized by some on the right in America, or hawkish people in America, for signing up to something that looks a bit more like the Obama nuclear deal. Now, my understanding was that this current memorandum of understanding, although it hasn't been published yet, doesn't really deal with the nuclear issue, and that all gets kicked into the long grass. But I don't know, do you have a different... Is there something more concrete in this deal about nuclear enrichment than I'm sort of giving it credit for?
Michael, you're right that the MOU itself, this framework deal, doesn't specifically obligate steps for Iran to take in terms of eliminating its stockpile of highly enriched uranium or providing verification or monitoring access around its nuclear program. But the idea of the MOU is that it establishes the framework for further negotiations on those issues. And I think here is an aspect of this deal that is somewhat innovative. The challenge of nuclear diplomacy between the US and Iran had always been that after the withdrawal of the US from the nuclear deal in 2018, in the first Trump term, there was a problem of credibility. How could Iran undertake complex negotiations with the US and decide a whole host of mutual obligations in terms of the sequencing of nuclear concessions with economic concessions, and trust that at the end of that complex negotiations, the deal that was agreed would actually be implemented? And in some ways, I think that the MOU is a smart approach, because what it does is it establishes the principles for the negotiations that are set to take place. And here, for example, we heard today the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson talking about the fact that the MOU, in his language, in a sense, obligates the US to pursue the complete lifting of sanctions on Iran. Now, does that mean that the MOU itself triggers the complete lifting of sanctions? No, but it establishes the expectation that if Iran were to undertake a certain series of steps with regards to its nuclear program, it could reasonably expect that the US would take steps on its side, leading to broad sanctions relief. So it creates a kind of a way in which the two sides can build confidence incrementally in the course of negotiations. I think that's novel, and I think that has some potential of dealing with the credibility problem inherent around negotiations with Trump. That being said, I do feel that we should be skeptical that this framework deal will lead to a comprehensive agreement, because we haven't really seen a strong aptitude in the Trump administration for going from kind of these phase one diplomatic deals to larger and more comprehensive diplomatic understandings in other arenas in which they've engaged in high-level diplomacy.
I want to talk about what we've learned about the global economy over the past 4 months, because it's been basically 4 months now that the Strait of Hormuz has been largely closed. There were at the start of this war lots of people, when Iran initially closed the Strait of Hormuz, saying, we're set for $200 a barrel oil. The fertilizer blockage means that there's going to be sort of catastrophic crop failures. And I suppose from my perspective, admittedly not sort of following this very closely over the past few weeks, for the last 2 months, everyone seems to have forgotten about the Iran war. Oil has been under $100 for a while now, for weeks. Is the global economy in a way more resilient than many people had given it credit for when it comes to a crunch point like this?
On one hand, yes. I think what you can see is that, not unlike in other cases where there's a sort of exogenous shock to the global economy, maybe COVID being another example, markets and economic operators, they find a way of keeping things kind of ticking along. They find alternatives, and they pursue redundancies, and that's how they're able to basically deal with something like a critical energy choke point being closed for the better part of 4 months. On the other hand, I think we've sort of gotten lucky in that we did not see more profound economic shockwaves as a result of this war. And I don't think it is a surprise that the negotiations culminated in a framework agreement at this precise moment. As the summer was dragging on, we were approaching a point at which the ability of markets to kind of price in a resolution for this crisis, and therefore keep the prices of certain commodities in a reasonable range, like the price of oil, was going to hit the reality of physical disruptions having gone on for so long that it was untenable that we wouldn't see more dramatic impacts in the global economy. I mean, some analysts have pointed to really quite unique and somewhat unexpected dynamics where, for example, China, because it had developed this really enormous strategic stockpile of crude oil, was able to dramatically reduce its imports in the last couple months, which ultimately alleviated pressure on the global oil market while the Strait of Hormuz remained closed. At some point, China, like many other countries, was going to draw down its reserves and would need to tap the markets again in a more significant way. And that would have necessarily driven up the price of oil. So, I think those who maybe were skeptics of the idea that economic pressure was going to play a role in the resolution of this conflict, they might look at this moment and say that they were right ultimately, that we didn't see $200 for a barrel of oil. But at the same time, I think at the end of the day, if you look at the actual dynamics that were emerging and the way that pressure was mounting, those stopgap solutions were going to fail at some point. And that probably did factor into the mentality of the Trump administration in thinking, you know what, we actually need to get this deal over the line. And there's a reason why our regional allies are pushing us to do so. They're at the coalface here, and they see the chaos that is going to hit the markets if they don't get their oil moving very soon.
Let's imagine that this does go, to some degree, along the lines that you've suggested, whereby sort of America has the credibility to sign up, or Trump has the credibility to sign up to something that looks a bit like the Obama nuclear deal. In that respect, we go back to sort of the status quo before the Trump administration, even the first one. What will have changed fundamentally, though, because of this conflict, I suppose, particularly perhaps in the Gulf, maybe the relationship of Israel to the United States, Iran's self-conception of itself and its own influence in the region? What do you think will be the big sort of shifts in geopolitics, which would have been engendered by this war?
I don't think that we would go back to something like the situation in 2015, 2016. The technical parameters of this deal may be similar to the JCPOA, but the geopolitical context is dramatically different. Part of the reason we are at this moment is that ultimately we are dealing with the reality that the US is no longer a security guarantor in the Middle East. If anything, actually, given Trump's approach to Iran and the fact that he went headlong into this war, the US emerged as a destabilizing force for the sort of tenuous security that we had in the region, and was all too willing to kind of work with Israel along those lines. And the fact that you had this really unique constellation of regional countries led by the regional powers of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, and then with the assistance of Qatar and Oman, and even somewhat reluctantly the UAE in trying to get this deal over the line. What that shows you is that there's a recognition among the countries of the region that they need to develop their own capacities to ensure their own security, because they cannot depend on the US to have the kind of prudence to manage the conflicting interests and the threat perceptions in the region in a responsible way moving forward, especially not when Israel has such undue influence in Washington and is able to sway decision-making within this administration. And so in that context, I think this is a very different moment. The other thing I would add is that, again, although I am skeptical that the deal will be consolidated into a comprehensive agreement, the possibility is there. And now that we have had the US-Iran war that was long feared, and now that the Iranian leadership has survived that kind of conflict, there is an opportunity here, an opening for what we could call transformative diplomacy between the US and Iran. President Trump is perhaps uniquely someone who can pursue a major deal that maybe even leads to normalization of diplomatic ties with Iran without facing the kind of political blowback in Washington that would have prevented other US presidents from going that far. And that is something that the Iranian side is aware of. They don't trust Trump, but they do see him as having this unique capacity to do things that other presidents may not have been willing to do. And so there is an opportunity to maybe pursue this diplomacy to its full extent, where at the end of it, you actually break out of this nearly 50 years of animosity between the US and Iran. And Trump has, articulated ideas along these lines when he talks about, trying to be friends with the Iranians or working with the Iranians to bring peace to the region. We shouldn't put a lot of weight in these words, but the simple fact that he can say these things when other presidents would have bitten their tongues shows us that at least there is that sliver of an opening in the doorway through which you might get some more, really, I think, a change in how the region views itself and how the region relates to the US that could be very constructive in the medium to long term.